who were just recently prosecuted in Italy. But you write about this, specifically somebody, Binyamin Mohammed, who's picked up in Karachi in '02, ended up in Morocco, then ultimately released. You talk about Arar, a guy from Canada. You talk about another man from Pakistan. All these guys get picked up by other organizations, and then they're held. If that still happens, whether we're doing rendition or not, but they're doing it on our behalf, it's equally bad, potentially.
Well, certainly, and I guess the danger is that I think having followed these stories now for a number of years, the recurring theme really is secrecy, and we see so many cases that are just blotted out because we don't know what's happening. It's all covered in the name of national security, and so this is a very, very murky area, and it's hard to know exactly what's happening because it's increasingly being pushed off the books, and that's sort of the danger that I saw in the reporting that I was doing, was that the more we declare certain things off limits, like, say, black sites, the danger is, are we pushing that same behavior off further into the shadows? And proxy detentions and interrogations would certainly be one area where there is a danger of that happening.
Actually, it's a great point. I was down broadcasting and working in Guantanamo Bay a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things I kept thinking about was, on the island, at least the ICRC, the Red Cross, is right there. I mean, relatively close. There's at least some oversight. You have a relative idea on who these people are, how long they've been here, and their identities. Whereas if they're simply not brought to Guantanamo Bay, well, that doesn't mean you can't torture somebody anyplace else if you're so inclined. And I mean, that's also part of the difficulty.
Certainly, and I mean, people like Binya Mohammed are an example of this broader phenomenon, and there are very few people like Binyam who actually get identified. But the fact is that all of these cases, the domestic terrorism cases that we're seeing, and these overseas cases, they become connected through the gathering of intelligence, because the interrogations that are happening overseas, whether they're happening in Pakistan or whether they're happening in other countries, the interrogations that were happening in Guantanamo, all of the intelligence that is gathered through these interrogations then sort of is transferred between agencies, and it's shared, and it actually does even trickle down into these domestic, or I would say sort of cases that are prosecuted in the federal courts. But you never really see the provenance of this intelligence because it's always deemed secret in the interest of national security. And determining the veracity of this intelligence is really tricky. If not for that reason, then simply, how can a defense attorney or even sometimes prosecutors don't see this evidence in full, where it's coming from, how it was gathered, under what conditions, and that becomes problematic, especially in terrorism prosecutions, because you often end up prosecuting a crime that hasn't technically happened yet. You're prosecuting someone who's accused of terrorism, but they haven't actually committed the terrorist act yet.
I want to come back to this Aafia Saddiqui again. They're claiming that, in fact, she really did try to kill some military personnel. Can you talk to me about how this is actually playing out, what it is that the prosecution is going to say, but what it is that you found, and the inconsistencies all over the board?
Well, the actual crime that she's accused of is a very narrow shooting incident where she was found in Afghanistan last summer, and she was picked up by Afghan police, and she was taken to a local Afghan police station. And the day after she was arrested, U.S. soldiers and FBI agents came to question her, and they were led into an interview room where she supposedly was hiding behind a curtain. This is the prosecution's version of the case. And the government is arguing that while these soldiers were in the room and she was hiding behind this curtain, they sat down and one of them put his weapon on the floor, and that she pulled it under the curtain, and without them noticing, then pulled the curtain back and opened fire on them. She didn't hit anyone, but they fired back, and she was herself hit.
Well,
so the question
let me get this
really,
right. So
it sounds crazy. I've actually looked at I've seen pictures of the room. It's a tiny little room. The curtain is basically like a sheet that was strung across the room. So it just raises a ton of questions, starting with why would they put down a loaded weapon? Why would they not have looked behind the curtain? Who was really in that room? the questions go on, and we'll see what happens at the trial if there will be satisfactory answers.
It just strikes me as very odd, if let me get this right, the Afghan government actually picks her up and then calls American forces, and then when the American forces come, they put her in a room and she's hiding in that room after an entire at least 24-hour period. That doesn't even strike me as logical, let alone anything else.
Well, there's some of this can be explained on the ground in Afghanistan. The U.S. military obviously has a huge presence, and it's not. I don't think it's actually unusual for information to be shared about these kinds of cases. And so I wasn't really surprised to see that there was a U.S. contingent coming to question her. In fact.
But it gets pretty darn weird. Actually, it makes total sense to me that the Americans would show up, but what doesn't make sense to me is that she's going to be hiding behind a sheet in the very same room where they happen to be, and then all of a sudden they basically empty a couple of rounds into her stomach. That just strikes me as very odd.
Yes, it does. That she would be held unsecured in a small room, that they wouldn't think to look there, that, if you try to, I've actually tried to sketch out the scenario as it's described in the criminal complaint, and it seems almost physically impossible for it to have happened the way that it's being described. It's a tiny little room, and she really would have tried. This is a huge weapon. It's not like she pulled a small service revolver under a curtain. It's an M4, not a small weapon.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks sort of like an M16. Hey, thank you very much, Petra. I sure appreciate the time today.
Thanks for having me.